This is Atlas, broadcasting live to anyone who can still hear me. You've tuned into the graveyard, your lifeline in the dark. If you're hearing this, you've made it through another day, another night, another fight. That's something worth recognizing. Survivors, the world may have shifted beneath us, but as long as you keep moving, keep adapting, there's still hope to hold on to. It's been 3 weeks since my last broadcast, and I've been on the move, gathering what I can: information, supplies, and a better understanding of what's happening out there. Things are changing faster than I expected, faster than I can explain. Some of it is subtle, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Other things, they're impossible to ignore. And it's those things we need to talk about. So listen closely. What I'm about to tell you might just keep you alive. First, let me say this: the world is not the same as it was even a month ago. The land itself feels restless. I've walked roads that seem familiar, only to find them leading nowhere, twisting into loops that pull you back to where you started. Buildings I've used as waypoints, places I've taken shelter in, are just gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, gone. Erased. And it's not random. There's a pattern to it. The places vanishing, they're tied to the other changes, the silent zones, the glowing residue, and the infected behavior that's becoming harder to predict. We'll get into that, but for now, just know this: if you rely on landmarks to navigate, double-check everything. What you think you know might not be there anymore. Speaking of navigation, the skies are telling a story of their own. I've seen clouds behaving in ways that defy logic, spiraling into perfect rings or forming unnatural patterns above certain areas. There's something about them that feels deliberate, as if the sky itself is marking places we should avoid. Survivors have reported flashes of light within these clouds, but there's no thunder, no storm, just bursts of brightness that seem to pulse in rhythm, almost like a signal. I don't know what they mean, but I've learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts say to keep your distance. There's another change, one that's harder to explain but impossible to ignore. The air in some places feels wrong. Heavy, charged, like it's pressing down on you. Clings to your skin, makes your chest feel tight, like you're standing too close to something you shouldn't be near. Survivors have described it as suffocating, and I've felt it myself. It's usually paired with that faint hum I've mentioned before, the one that crawls under your skin and stays there long after you've left. If you feel it, if the air shifts around you, don't wait to see what comes next. Move, quickly. I've also noticed something else during my travels. Something that doesn't sit right. Survivors, when was the last time you saw wildlife? I don't mean the infected animals we've started encountering. I mean the normal ones, the ones that used to scatter at the sound of footsteps or rifle fire. It's like they've disappeared. The forests are empty, the fields are silent, and even the birds have stopped singing. In their place, there's this stillness that feels alive, like the land itself is waiting for something. I don't have an answer for you, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't unnerve me. Now, let's talk about the infected. I've seen things recently that don't match what we've come to expect. They're gathering in ways that feel strategic, deliberate. I've seen groups of them standing perfectly still, forming lines or circles around objects that seem meaningless. An overturned car, a crumbling statue, a random patch of earth. They don't move, don't groan, don't react. They just stand there, as if guarding something or waiting for a signal. And when they do move, it's with a coordination that's hard to believe. They're not just stumbling toward noise anymore. They're thinking or something close to it. If you've been relying on noise traps or tripwires, it might be time to rethink your strategy. One last thing before we move on. I've picked up reports of lights on the horizon. Blue, red, white, flickering in ways that don't match any fire or flashlight I've seen. They're distant, always just out of reach, but survivors have described being drawn to them, like moths to a flame. Some say the lights lead to nowhere, while others claim they found strange symbols or markings at the end of their path. I don't know what's causing them, but if you see one, don't follow it blindly. Observe, take notes, but stay cautious. Whatever's behind those lights isn't welcoming you. Survivors, this is the reality we're living in. The world is changing in ways we can't predict, and every day brings something new to adapt to. But you're still here. You've made it this far, and that tells me you've got what it takes to keep going. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and let's get through this together. There's more to cover, and we're just getting started. Survivors, let's talk about the sky. It's easy to overlook what's above us when most of our focus is on the ground. The infected, the traps, the shifting land. But lately, I've noticed something off about the clouds. I don't mean the typical gray masses we associate with storms or rain. These are different. They're precise, deliberate, as if the sky itself is part of the changes we've been witnessing on the ground. Over the past few weeks, survivors have sent in reports of strange cloud formations appearing in various parts of the region. These clouds don't drift or scatter like normal. They form distinct shapes, spirals, and rings, almost too perfect to be natural. Some of these formations linger for hours, hanging in the sky as if they're marking something below. Others shift quickly, spiraling in ways that defy the flow of the wind. It's not just unsettling, it feels calculated, as if someone or something is orchestrating it. I've seen it myself. About a week ago, I was traveling through what used to be a rural stretch of farmland. The sky was clear when I started, just a pale expanse of nothingness. But as I moved further into the area, I noticed a ring of clouds forming directly overhead. It wasn't gradual, like a storm rolling in, it was immediate. One moment, the sky was empty. The next, there it was, a perfect circle of dense, white cloud, with a strange shimmering effect at its edges. It didn't move with the wind, didn't dissipate. It just hung there watching. And it's not just the shapes. Survivors have reported seeing flashes of light within these clouds, bursts of brightness that don't come with thunder or rain. One group described a spiral formation over an abandoned industrial park that pulsed with light at regular intervals. They said it was like a heartbeat, steady and rhythmic, and that it cast faint shadows on the ground below. The group didn't stay long enough to figure out what was causing it, and honestly, I don't blame them. There's another element to these clouds that makes them even more unnerving: the way they seem tied to specific locations. Survivors have noticed that these formations often appear above places where other anomalies are happening: silent zones, glowing residue, or clusters of infected behaving strangely. It's as if the sky is responding to what's happening on the ground, mirroring the chaos below. Some have speculated that the clouds might be some kind of warning, a way for the world to signal that a place is unsafe. Others think it's something far more deliberate, a message from forces we don't understand. But the most disturbing thing I've heard so far came from a lone traveler who was passing through an old mining town. He described seeing a dense cloud bank forming above the town as he approached, its edges glowing faintly with a soft blue light. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the setting sun, but then the air around him grew cold, unnaturally cold, like stepping into a freezer. He said the glow in the clouds started to pulse, and with each pulse, he felt a vibration in the ground beneath his feet. It wasn't loud, just a faint hum that he felt more than heard. He turned back before reaching the town, and as he retreated, he noticed the glow fade, the clouds dispersing as quickly as they'd formed. I don't know what these clouds mean, but I've learned not to dismiss anything in this world as coincidence. If you see formations like these, don't assume they're harmless. Watch the patterns, note the direction, and be aware of what's happening around you. These clouds might not be random. They could be connected to whatever is reshaping the land, the infected, and even the air we breathe. I've also started mapping these occurrences, marking where the reports have come from. What's strange is that they seem to form a loose network, overlapping with other reported anomalies. The clouds aren't just appearing anywhere. They're clustering near areas that survivors have already flagged as strange or dangerous. It's like they're marking points on a map, highlighting places we need to avoid, or places we need to pay closer attention to. Some of you might be wondering if it's worth investigating these areas. Ive at Bizagodyun. We're already dealing with enough on the ground without adding the sky to our list of threats. But if you do find yourself under one of these formations, keep your head down and move quickly. The longer you stay, the more likely you are to notice things that don't feel right. Shifts in the air, strange sounds, or even that low hum I've mentioned before. The sky isn't just a backdrop anymore. Survivors, is part of the story, part of the world that's changing around us. Pay attention to it. Look up, but don't linger. Whatever's happening up there, it's tied to what's happening here, and ignoring it won't make it go away. The clouds are speaking in their own way, and while we may not understand the language yet, it's only a matter of time before we start to see the full picture. Keep moving, survivors. There's more to uncover, and the world isn't waiting for us to catch up. Survivors, let's focus on something that's easy to miss but impossible to ignore once you notice it: the ground beneath your feet. It's always been one of the few constants in this ever-shifting world, solid and steady, but lately, even that feels like it's turning against us. There's something happening beneath the surface, something subtle but insistent. I've been feeling it during my travels, and the reports coming in suggest I'm not alone. Vibrations, not the kind you'd expect from natural causes like a distant earthquake or heavy machinery. These are different, faint, rhythmic pulses that seem to come from nowhere and carry a strange, almost hypnotic pattern. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the fatigue playing tricks on me. But the more I moved, the clearer it became. These vibrations aren't random, and they aren't harmless. About a week ago, I felt it most strongly near an old industrial zone. The place was already eerie. Rows of rusted pipes, crumbling smokestacks, and pools of stagnant water reflecting a dull gray sky. But as I moved further in, I noticed the ground beneath me felt alive. Every step carried a faint hum, like a low-frequency signal vibrating just under the surface. It wasn't enough to shake the ground or make noise, but it was there, a steady pulse you could feel if you stood still long enough. I stopped to get a better sense of it, crouching down and placing a hand on the cold concrete. That's when it hit me. The vibrations weren't just random, they had a rhythm, a pattern that repeated every few seconds. It was almost like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, pulsing through the ground in waves. The air around me felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. And then there was the hum. Survivors, if you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. It's faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a distant engine. But the longer you listen, the more it seeps into you. It's not just a sound. It's a feeling, a vibration that resonates in your chest, your bones, like it's trying to pull you into sync with it. I've heard it described as calming, even soothing, but to me, it's the opposite. It feels wrong, unnatural, like it doesn't belong here. Other survivors have reported similar experiences. One group traveling through a collapsed train yard said they felt the vibrations strongest near an old locomotive, its rusted frame half buried in the earth. They described the same rhythmic pulsing, the same hum, and something else: the sense that the ground beneath them wasn't solid. They said it felt spongy, like walking on a surface that could give way at any moment. They didn't stick around to test that theory, and I can't say I blame them. There's another layer to this that makes it even more unsettling. Survivors have started noticing that these vibrations are often accompanied by other anomalies: glowing residue on nearby surfaces, strange symbols etched into the ground, even infected clustering in unervingly precise formations. It's like all these phenomena are tied together, part of some larger pattern we can't see yet. I don't know if the vibrations are causing the other changes or if they're a symptom of something even bigger, but the connection is hard to ignore. One report that stood out came from a group moving through a stretch of farmland. They described feeling the vibrations as they passed an old grain silo, the metal frame humming faintly in the silence. But what caught their attention was what happened when they tried to leave. The vibrations seemed to follow them, growing fainter as they moved further away but never fully disappearing. One of them swore they could feel it even hours later, a faint pulsing in their chest that wouldn't stop. It wasn't until they crossed a river that the feeling finally faded. Then there's the metallic tang in the air. I've noticed it myself, and it seems to be a common thread in these reports. It's sharp, almost acidic, like the smell of burnt metal or ozone. It clings to the back of your throat, leaves a taste in your mouth that's hard to shake. Survivors have described it as a warning sign, a precursor to the vibrations. If you smell it, The hum isn't far behind. There's no telling what's causing this. Is it tied to the infection, some side effect of whatever's reshaping the land? Or is it something deeper, something buried beneath the surface, waking up after years of dormancy? I don't have the answers, but I'm starting to think the ground we've always trusted isn't as solid as we believed. If you've felt these vibrations, if you've heard the hum, pay attention to your surroundings. Mark the area if you can, but don't linger. These places might hold clues to what's happening, but they're not safe. The world is shifting beneath our feet, survivors, and it's not waiting for us to catch up. Keep moving, and remember, the ground is no longer just a place to stand. It's part of the puzzle, and it's changing just like everything else. Survivors, let's talk about the infected. Not the ones we've grown used to, the ones that shamble aimlessly, groaning as they hunt for whatever draws their attention. No, this is something different, something new. Over the past few weeks, reports have been coming in of infected behavior that doesn't just defy expectations, it rewrites them entirely. It's as if they're claiming the land in ways we've never seen before, turning parts of the world into territories that don't belong to us anymore. I've seen it myself during my travels. Groups of infected gathering in clusters, not wandering but standing still, perfectly still around certain landmarks. At first glance, it looks random. An old gas station, a collapsed bridge, a burned-out vehicle. But the more you observe, the less random it feels. They're not just standing there for no reason. They're guarding something, or perhaps waiting for something. And it's not just a few of them. In some places, there are dozens. Their stillness more unnerving than any frantic charge could ever be. I've seen them in patterns that feel deliberate. Lines stretching across a road, blocking access to whatever lies beyond. Circles around objects that seem insignificant at first. A pile of rubble, a patch of ground, a solitary tree. It's as if they're marking these places, turning them into points of significance we can't understand. One group of survivors describes stumbling upon a cluster of infected gathered around a rusted-out truck in the middle of an open field. They weren't moving, weren't making a sound, just standing there, shoulder to shoulder, their heads slightly tilted as if listening to something we can't hear. The survivors didn't stick around to figure out what it was. What's even more unnerving is the way these clusters seem to interact with the environment. I've noticed patterns in the ground near these gatherings. Spirals etched into the dirt, symbols burned into concrete, faint traces of glowing residue that seem to pulse faintly in the dark. It's almost as if the infected are drawn to these places because of what's already there, or maybe they're the ones leaving these marks behind. Either way, it's hard to shake the feeling that these sites are significant, even if we don't know why. Then there's the behavior itself. Survivors have reported infected that no longer react the way we expect. One group described setting up a noise trap, a simple alarm meant to lure them away from their camp. But instead of blindly charging toward the sound, the infected stopped just short of the trap, tilting their heads as if studying it. And then they did something no one expected. They turned away, moving deliberately around the area without triggering the trap. It wasn't instinct, it was intention. I've heard similar stories of infected avoiding tripwires, pausing at barricades as if weighing their options. In one particularly chilling report, a group of survivors watched as a cluster of infected dismantled a makeshift barrier they'd built to block a narrow alley. The infected didn't smash through it, they pulled it apart piece by piece, working together in a way that felt too coordinated to be random. By the time the survivors realized what was happening, it was too late. They barely escaped. And it's not just the avoidance of traps or obstacles. There's something else happening, something even harder to explain. Survivors have reported infected mimicking human behavior, crouching when we crouch, turning their heads in the same direction, even pointing when we point. At first, it seemed like coincidence, a byproduct of whatever remnants of humanity the infection hadn't wiped away. But the more you observe, the clearer it becomes. This isn't mimicry for the sake of mimicry. It's learning. One survivor shared a story that still gives me chills. They were traveling through the outskirts of an abandoned city, trying to stay out of sight. They spotted an infected standing in the distance, motionless, its back turned. The survivor decided to test something, raising their hand slowly. The infected mirrored the movement, raising its hand in the exact same way. It wasn't groaning, wasn't moving forward, just standing there, copying them. The survivor didn't wait to see what happened next. And then there are the infected that seem to be drawn to specific locations, as if following some unseen command. Survivors have reported large groups moving together in straight lines, heading toward abandoned factories, water towers, or even seemingly random spots in the middle of nowhere. When they reach these places, they don't scatter or attack. They stand still, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, staring at something invisible. It's as if they're waiting for instructions, or for whatever force is guiding them to make its next move. Whatever's happening, it's clear the infected are no longer the mindless threats we once thought they were. They're adapting, evolving, becoming something more dangerous and far harder to predict. If they're learning from us, if they're claiming the land in ways we don't understand, then we need to be more vigilant than ever. These territories they're creating, they don't belong to us anymore, and the infected are making sure we know it. Survivors, I've always believed that what we see is one of the few things we can trust in this world. But lately, even that belief is starting to crack. It's not the infected this time, or the land shifting beneath our feet. It's something more subtle, more insidious. Reflections, mirrors, puddles, windows, even polished metal. They're starting to show us things that shouldn't be there. The first reports I heard about this came weeks ago, but at the time I didn't give them much weight. Survivors would mention catching movement in the corner of their eyes, only to look and find nothing there. Or they'd see shapes in puddles that didn't match the world above them. I chalked it up to exhaustion, fear playing tricks on tired minds. But the more I've traveled, the more I've seen it myself, and now I can't ignore it. A few days ago, I passed through a cluster of abandoned homes just before sunset. The place was eerily quiet, even for these times. No infected, no birds, not even the sound of the wind. As I moved through the empty streets, I noticed something odd in one of the windows. It wasn't broken, which in itself felt strange, but that wasn't what stopped me. What stopped me was my reflection. At first glance, it looked normal. Just me, standing there with the sky darkening behind me. But as I moved, the reflection didn't move with me. It stayed still, staring back with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then it blinked. Not out of sync with me, no, it blinked on its own, slow and deliberate. I didn't stay long after that. I don't know what it was, but I wasn't about to find out. I've heard similar stories from survivors since then. One group scavenging near a collapsed train station described seeing their reflections in a pool of oil. They said the reflections didn't just mimic them, they moved before they did, like they were predicting their actions. One of them swore they saw their reflection smile just before they turned away. They didn't stay to confirm it, and I can't say I blame them. Then there's the survivor who found themselves staring into a cracked mirror in an old motel. They described seeing something behind their reflection, a shape that wasn't in the room with them. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the shattered glass, but the shape moved closer, its edges sharp and indistinct. It wasn't the reflection of the room or anything they could explain. They smashed the mirror and left immediately, but they said the image stayed with them, burned into their memory like a brand. It's not just mirrors, either. Survivors have reported strange things happening with puddles and pools of water. One story came from a traveler passing through a rain-soaked parking lot. They looked down and saw their reflection distorted, the edges warping and twisting as if the water was alive. When they leaned closer, they saw something that froze them in place. Images of a place they'd never been, glowing faintly in the depths of the water. They described it as a city, its streets lined with lights that flickered like fireflies. And then it was gone, the water rippling as if it had never been there. There are also reports of reflections showing symbols, spirals, lines, patterns we've seen etched into the land. Survivors have described looking into reflective surfaces and seeing these symbols glowing faintly, even though they weren't present in the real world. One woman described finding a shard of glass on the ground and seeing a series of overlapping triangles glowing faintly in the reflection. When she turned the shard over to check the other side, the symbols were gone. The most unsettling thing, though, is how these reflections seem to interact with us. Survivors have described them as watchful, deliberate, almost alive. One man told me about looking into the side mirror of an old car, only to see a figure standing in the reflection that wasn't behind him. It was featureless, a silhouette of darkness that seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. He ran, but he said he could feel it watching him even after he'd put miles between himself and that mirror. I don't know what's causing this. Is it tied to the infection, the glowing residue, the symbols we've been finding? Or is it something entirely separate, something that's been waiting for a moment like this to make itself known? Whatever it is, it's clear that reflections aren't just reflections anymore. They've become windows to something else, something that doesn't belong in our world. If you encounter a reflection that doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Don't linger. Don't try to figure it out. These things, whatever they are, aren't meant to be understood, not yet, anyway. The world is showing us pieces of itself we weren't meant to see, and the more we look, the more it seems to look back. Stay sharp, survivors. Even your own reflection might not be what it seems. Survivors, let's talk about something that's been gnawing at the edges of my mind. Disappearances. Not just people, though we've all seen our share of that. I'm talking about places, whole stretches of land, familiar landmarks, and structures we've relied on vanishing without a trace. It's not erosion, not decay, not the usual wear and tear that this world inflicts. It's like they're being erased, removed from existence entirely. It started subtly. A bridge that used to cross a shallow river was no longer there. Not collapsed, not damaged, just gone. The river flowed undisturbed, as if it had never been spanned. Survivors who've walked the same paths for months suddenly find themselves standing in front of empty fields where buildings used to stand. Some have even said the ground itself feels wrong, as if it's too smooth, too untouched, like nature was never supposed to take root there. I've seen it myself. A few days ago, I revisited an old gas station I've used as a waypoint more times than I can count. It was a reliable spot, tucked away off the main roads, with a clear view of the surrounding area. But when I arrived, it wasn't there. The pumps, the cracked asphalt, even the rusted sign, gone. In its place was an empty patch of grass, untouched and pristine, as if no one had ever set foot there. The air around it felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name, and the silence was absolute. It didn't feel like nature reclaiming its space. It felt deliberate. I'm not the only one noticing this. Survivors have shared similar stories, and the details are always disturbingly consistent. Entire neighborhoods wiped clean, leaving nothing behind but bare earth. Roads that end abruptly in jagged drops, as if they've been sliced through with surgical precision. One group described a railway bridge they'd been using for weeks. They passed through it on their way to scavenge and returned hours later to find it missing. No wreckage, no sign of decay, just a gap where the bridge used to be. It's as if the world is selectively deleting itself, piece by piece. And it's not just structures. Survivors have reported forests that seem to shrink overnight, trails that vanish without a trace, and rivers that change course as if they're being redirected. One report came from a group traveling through what used to be farmland. They described a narrow dirt road flanked by fields of overgrown wheat. The next day, the road was gone, replaced by a thicket of trees so dense they couldn't find a way through. They swore it was impossible. There hadn't been any sign of the forest the day before, but there it was, as real as the ground beneath their feet. Then there's the issue of time. Survivors have started noticing discrepancies in how long it takes to travel familiar routes. A journey that used to take an hour now stretches into 3, or worse, the opposite. A trip that should have taken all day ends in half the time with no explanation. One group described traveling through a canyon they'd crossed many times before, only to find themselves emerging into a completely unfamiliar landscape. They checked their map, retraced their steps, but nothing made sense. It was as if the canyon itself had shifted, spitting them out into a part of the world that shouldn't exist. What's even more unsettling is how these disappearances seem to target survivor camps. I've heard multiple accounts of campsites left intact but completely abandoned, supplies untouched, fires still smoldering, even the beds neatly made. But the people, gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just a void where they used to be. One survivor described finding a convoy of vehicles parked neatly on the side of a highway. The cars were in perfect condition, keys still in the ignitions, but every seat was empty. They searched the surrounding area but found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no clues. And then there's the phenomenon of disappearing groups. Entire clusters of survivors vanishing as if they were plucked from existence. One group shared a chilling account of finding a village that had been bustling with survivors just days earlier. When they returned, the village was empty. The buildings were still there, but the people were gone. What struck them most was the stillness. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the absence of life. Even the infected seemed to avoid the place. I've also heard whispers of strange lights appearing in these areas before the disappearances happen. Survivors describe seeing flickering blue or red lights hovering in the distance, always out of reach. Some have followed them, thinking they were a signal from other survivors, only to find empty spaces where something once stood. One report mentioned a water tower disappearing after a night of strange lights dancing around its base. The next morning, the tower was gone, and the ground where it had stood was scorched black. What's causing this? Is it tied to the infection, to the environmental changes we've been seeing, or to something else entirely? Whatever it is, it feels intentional, like the world is folding in on itself, erasing the parts it no longer needs. And if that's the case, then where does that leave us? Survivors, if you find yourself in a place that feels wrong, too quiet, too empty, or too clean, trust your instincts. The things disappearing might not stop at buildings and landmarks. The next time something vanishes, it might not be the land. It might be us. Survivors, let's shift our focus to something I've been hearing about more frequently: light trails. They've been cropping up in unexpected places, moving in ways that don't make sense. At first glance, they might seem harmless, even beautiful, but don't let that fool you. These trails aren't natural, and they don't lead to anything good. The first report I received about these lights came from a group of scavengers moving through an old highway at night. They described faint, glowing blue lines snaking across the cracked asphalt, weaving in and out of the wreckage. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the moonlight reflecting off something metallic, but as they got closer, they realized the light was moving. Slowly, deliberately, like it was alive. They said the glow was faint, barely visible unless you were looking for it, but it had an otherworldly quality that made it impossible to ignore. I've since heard more stories, and the details are disturbingly consistent. These light trails appear without warning, often in places that are otherwise unremarkable. Abandoned parking lots, overgrown fields, forgotten alleys. The trails are thin, barely wider than a hand, and they pulse faintly as if responding to some unseen force. Survivors have described them as eerily beautiful, but there's always a catch. Following these trails never ends well. One survivor told me about encountering a light trail while traveling through an overgrown park. They said the trail started at the base of a statue, winding its way through the grass and disappearing into the trees. Curious, they decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to something useful, a cache of supplies maybe, or another survivor's signal. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the air began to change. It grew colder, heavier, and the faint hum that seems to accompany so many of these anomalies started to creep in. By the time they realized the light was leading them in circles, it was too late. They turned back, but the trail had vanished, and the forest didn't look the same anymore. They eventually made it out, but not without a deep sense that they'd narrowly escaped something far worse than the infected. Another group shared a similar experience near a collapsed bridge. They spotted a trail of light winding down the side of the ravine, leading to what looked like an old storage container. It was faint, just enough to catch their attention, and they thought it might be a signal. As they descended, the light grew brighter, almost inviting. But when they reached the container, it was empty, save for a series of strange, glowing symbols etched into the metal. The moment they stepped inside, the light faded, leaving them in complete darkness. They described the silence that followed as oppressive, almost deafening. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. There's another layer to this that makes it even more unsettling. Survivors have noticed that these light trails often appear near other anomalies, silent zones, glowing residue, and areas where infected behavior has been reported as unusual. It's as if the trails are connected to these phenomena, drawing attention to places we're better off avoiding. One survivor described following a trail that led directly to a cluster of infected standing in a perfect circle, their heads tilted toward the sky. They turned back before being noticed, but the image of those infected, illuminated by the faint glow of the trail, stayed with them. Some survivors have speculated that the trails might be a form of communication, a way for whatever's causing these changes to guide or manipulate us. Others think they're traps, designed to lure us into dangerous areas or keep us distracted from the real threats. Either way, the trails don't seem to follow any pattern we can understand. They appear randomly, often vanishing as quickly as they came, leaving no trace of their presence. I've seen one myself, though I didn't follow it. It appeared on a stretch of road I've traveled dozens of times, a faint blue line weaving through the cracks in the pavement. It didn't pulse or shift, just sat there, glowing faintly against the night. But as I stood there, watching it, I felt the air around me grow heavier, the faintest hint of a hum pressing against my ears. I decided to move on, and when I glanced back, the light was gone, as if it had never been there. What's most unsettling is the way these trails seem to interact with their surroundings. Survivors have described them moving, almost imperceptibly, as if adjusting their paths. One group even claimed to see a trail split in two, the new branch leading toward a cluster of glowing residue they hadn't noticed before. It's as if the trails are aware, reacting to us as much as we're reacting to them. If you encounter one of these light trails, be cautious. They may look harmless, even inviting, but there's a reason they're appearing now, in a world already saturated with danger and mystery. Whether they're a warning, a message, or something far more sinister, one thing is clear: they're not leading us anywhere safe. Stay sharp, survivors, and don't let curiosity lead you into the dark. Survivors, let's dive into something that's becoming harder to deny: the shifting landmarks. It's a phenomenon that feels like the world itself is playing tricks on us, moving pieces around while we're not looking. Roads that once led somewhere now lead to nowhere. Landmarks we've relied on are either gone or changed so much that they're unrecognizable. And in some cases, entirely new features have appeared where nothing should exist. It's not just me noticing this. The reports have been pouring in. Survivors have been traveling familiar paths only to find themselves lost in areas they've known for years. One traveler told me about a journey to a supply cache they'd visited a dozen times before. The route was straightforward, a stretch of highway with a distinctive red barn as a waypoint. But this time, the barn wasn't there. In its place was an overgrown field, the grass so high it obscured everything. They searched the area, convinced they'd taken a wrong turn, but they hadn't. The road was the same, the surroundings were familiar, but the barn and the cache were gone. I've experienced it myself. A week ago, I was moving through a stretch of forest I've used as a shortcut for months. It's an area I know well. Dense trees, a small creek cutting through the middle, and an old cabin I've used as a rest stop. But this time, something was different. The creek was wider, deeper, and the cabin was missing entirely. In its place was a clearing I didn't recognize, with a strange circular patch of blackened earth at its center. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and I didn't linger to investigate. What's unsettling is how precise these changes feel. This isn't nature reclaiming what's hers. It's deliberate, as if the land is being rewritten piece by piece. Survivors have described roads that end abruptly in sheer drops, with no rubble or signs of collapse. Just a clean edge where the asphalt stops and the void begins. Others have found trails looping endlessly, pulling them back to the same spot no matter which direction they take. One woman shared a story of walking a dirt path she'd used countless times, only to find herself passing the same fallen tree 3 times in a row, despite walking in what should have been a straight line. Then there are the new features, the things that shouldn't be there. Survivors have stumbled upon narrow canyons where there were once open fields, or massive rock formations that seem to have appeared overnight. One report described a series of jagged cliffs rising out of a previously flat plain, their edges sharp and unnatural. The group who found them said the air around the cliffs felt charged, like static before a storm. They didn't climb them, and I don't blame them. It's hard to trust something that feels like it was dropped there by design. There's also the matter of the unnatural patterns showing up in these areas. Survivors have reported spirals carved into the ground, overlapping lines burned into the earth, and symbols etched into rock faces. One group described finding a massive spiral etched into a dry riverbed, its lines so deep and precise it looked like it had been carved with a machine. They said the spiral seemed to hum faintly, a vibration they could feel in their bones. They didn't stay long enough to find out if it led somewhere. It's not just the land changing. Survivors have reported seeing landmarks that seem to shimmer, like heat waves rising off the pavement. One man described a water tower that flickered in and out of view as he approached, as if it was caught between existing and not. When he finally reached the spot, the tower was gone, replaced by a field of tall grass. He said the experience left him disoriented, like his sense of reality had been shaken loose. There's something about these shifting landmarks that feels tied to everything else we've been noticing. The glowing residue, the silent zones, the changes in infected behavior. Survivors have started mapping these anomalies, and the connections are hard to ignore. The areas where landmarks are disappearing or changing are often the same places where the infected are clustering or where strange symbols have been found. It's as if the world is reshaping itself around these focal points, bending and twisting to some unseen will. One of the most chilling reports I've heard came from a group traveling through what used to be a small town. They described walking down a street they knew well, lined with houses they'd scavenged many times before. But as they moved further in, the houses began to change. Windows disappeared, doors shifted to impossible angles, and the walls seemed to ripple, like they were made of liquid instead of wood and brick. The group turned back before reaching the center of town, but they said the experience left them shaken to their core. What's causing this? Some survivors believe the infection is spreading beyond the living, affecting the land itself. Others think it's tied to the strange symbols we've been finding, that these marks are somehow reshaping the environment around them. And then there are those who think it's something older, something deeper, forces we don't understand waking up in the chaos of a broken world. Whatever it is, one thing is clear. The ground we walk on, the landmarks we rely on, they're no longer constants. They're as fluid and unpredictable as the world around them. If you're traveling, don't rely solely on memory. Mark your maps, pay attention to your surroundings, and if something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. The land is changing, survivors, and it's not changing for us. Survivors, I need to talk about something that's been cropping up in more and more reports lately. They're being called observers, but what they are, or if they're even real, is up for debate. These figures have been seen at the edges of vision, just out of focus, watching. They don't move, don't make a sound, but their presence is impossible to ignore. If you've encountered one, you know what I'm talking about. The first time I heard about an observer, it was easy to dismiss as fear playing tricks on a weary mind. A lone survivor, traveling through a crumbling city, swore they saw a figure standing in the window of an abandoned office building. They said it didn't move, didn't react to their presence, but it was there, unmistakably human-shaped, silhouetted against the broken glass. When they mustered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. At the time, it seemed like a case of paranoia, the result of too many sleepless nights and too many close calls. But the reports didn't stop. In fact, they've been increasing. I've seen one myself. It was a few nights ago, while I was scouting a stretch of highway littered with rusted cars. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the road. That's when I noticed it. A figure standing in the distance, motionless in the middle of the asphalt. At first, I thought it might be an infected, but something about its stillness felt wrong. It wasn't hunched, wasn't shifting or groaning. It just stood there, its outline sharp against the pale light. I took a step forward, and it vanished, like a shadow swallowed by the night. I stayed still for a long time after that, listening, watching, but I never saw it again. Survivors have described similar encounters. One group traveling through a forest said they saw a figure standing among the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but they could feel it watching them. When they shined a flashlight in its direction, there was nothing there, just an empty patch of ground where it had been. Another survivor, passing through an abandoned mall, described seeing a figure reflected in a shattered storefront window. They turned to face it, but the corridor behind them was empty. The reflection lingered for a moment before fading. What's most unsettling about these observers is how they seem tied to the anomalies we've been encountering. Survivors have reported seeing them near silent zones, glowing residue, and the strange symbols etched into the land. One man described finding an observer standing at the edge of a field marked with spirals burned into the grass. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but he said the air around it felt wrong, thick, charged, like a storm about to break. He didn't stick around to see what it would do. There's another detail that keeps coming up in these reports. Survivors say they feel something when they see an observer, an undeniable sense of being watched, but also something deeper, more invasive. One woman described it as a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Another said it felt like the observer was pulling something from them, though they couldn't explain what. They left the area quickly, but the feeling lingered, a sense of unease that followed them long after the encounter. The observers don't seem to act, at least not in the way we're used to. They don't attack, don't move toward you, don't interact with the world around them. But their presence is impossible to ignore. Survivors have described feeling drawn to them, like they're being lured into stepping closer despite every instinct screaming to stay away. One man admitted he felt an overwhelming urge to approach an observer he saw standing in a ruined courtyard. He said it wasn't curiosity, it was compulsion. He managed to pull himself back before getting too close, but he said the experience left him shaken in a way he couldn't describe. There's no clear pattern to where these observers appear or when. They've been spotted in dense forests, open fields, crumbling cities, and empty highways. But there is one consistency. They never seem to be entirely present. Survivors often describe them as flickering, like static on a broken screen, or fading in and out of sight. One woman swore she saw an observer disappear the moment she blinked, only to reappear several feet closer when she opened her eyes. What are they? Some survivors think they're tied to the infection, a new stage of whatever's changing the infected into something more deliberate. Others believe they're part of the environment itself, a manifestation of the world's shifting rules. And then there are those who think they're something else entirely, watchers from beyond this world, here to observe and record as everything falls apart. I don't have answers, survivors. I don't know if these figures are real or if they're just another way this broken world is messing with our minds. But I do know this. If you see one, trust your instincts. Don't approach, don't linger, and don't ignore the feeling that something is watching. Because whatever these observers are, they're not here to help us. Stay alert, survivors. The shadows aren't as empty as they used to be. Survivors, let's talk about the air. I don't mean the weather, the storms, or even the eerie silences we've come to dread. No, I'm talking about something far stranger, the air itself, the space around us, and the way it started to feel alive. It's not just paranoia, not just the weight of the apocalypse pressing down on us. There's something happening in the atmosphere, and it's not natural. I first noticed it a few nights ago. I was moving through an open field, the kind of place where you can see for miles in every direction. The air was still, not a hint of wind, but it didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. As I kept walking, the sensation grew stronger. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the air seemed to press against me, clinging to my skin like a second layer. It felt thick, almost tangible, as if I could reach out and grab it. I stopped, trying to shake the feeling, and that's when I heard it, a faint crackling sound, so soft it was barely there. At first, I thought it was static, maybe interference from my equipment. But as I stood there, listening, I realized it wasn't coming from my radio. It was coming from the air itself, a subtle hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I left the field as quickly as I could, but the memory of that sound has stayed with me. Since then, I've heard similar stories from survivors. People describing the air growing heavier, colder, or somehow charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. One group traveling through an old industrial site said they felt the air grow thick as they approached a rusted water tower. They described a metallic taste in their mouths, a faint buzzing in their ears, and a sense of being watched. They didn't stay long, but they said the feeling lingered, as if the air had followed them even after they'd left. There's more to this than just sensations. Survivors have reported seeing distortions in the air. Faint, shimmering waves, like heat rising off asphalt on a hot day. But these distortions don't behave the way they should. They hover in place, unmoving, even when there's no heat to cause them. Some survivors have walked through these distortions, only to emerge feeling disoriented, nauseous, or even lost. One man told me about stepping into a shimmering patch of air in an empty parking lot. He said it felt like stepping into another world. Everything around him seemed muted, distant, as if he were underwater. When he finally stepped out, he realized he'd lost several hours without any memory of what had happened. It's not just the distortions. Survivors have described hearing whispers carried on the wind, faint voices that seem to come from nowhere. These whispers aren't constant, but when they appear, they're impossible to ignore. One group passing through a wooded area said they heard their names whispered from the trees, soft and urgent, as if someone was calling to them. They searched the area but found nothing. No signs of other survivors, no infected, just the empty forest and the whispers that seemed to follow them as they moved. There's another detail that keeps coming up in these reports. The air doesn't just feel heavy or alive, it feels aware. Survivors have described the unmistakable sensation of being watched, even when they're alone. It's not the usual paranoia of the apocalypse. The constant fear of infected lurking nearby is deeper, more personal, like the air itself is observing, recording, judging. One woman told me about walking through an empty train station and feeling eyes on her from every direction. She said the air seemed to shift around her, as if it were reacting to her movements. She didn't see anything, but the feeling stayed with her long after she'd left. Some survivors have started to notice patterns in where these anomalies occur. The charged air, the whispers, the shimmering distortions, they're often found near other phenomena, like glowing residue, shifting landmarks, and silent zones. It's as if these anomalies are connected, threads in a larger web we can't see. One man described finding a spiral burned into the ground in a field where the air felt heaviest. He said the spiral seemed to hum faintly, the sound vibrating in his chest. He didn't stay to find out what it meant, and I can't blame him. What's causing this? Some believe the infection is spreading beyond the living, affecting the very fabric of the world. Others think it's tied to the strange symbols we've been finding, that these marks are somehow reshaping the environment around them. And then there are those who think it's something else entirely, something older, deeper, and far more deliberate. Whatever it is, one thing is clear. The air isn't just air anymore. It's become part of the world's transformation, a force we don't understand and can't predict. If you feel the air grow heavy, if you hear the whispers or see the distortions, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts. These phenomena may not be as obvious as the infected or the shifting land, but they're just as dangerous. Stay sharp, survivors. The air is listening. Survivors, we've talked about the infected many times before. Their changes, their behavior, their terrifying evolution. But something new is happening. It's not their aggression or their uncanny coordination this time. It's their silence. Reports are coming in about infected moving in groups, large groups, but without the usual groans, screams, or chaotic shuffling. They're moving like shadows, quiet and deliberate, and it's sending chills down the spines of those who've seen it. The first mention of these silent herds came from a group traveling through what used to be a suburban neighborhood. They were scavenging for supplies, keeping to the back streets to avoid attention. When they saw them, a group of infected, at least 20 strong, moving through the streets in perfect unison. Not one of them made a sound. No groans, no dragging footsteps, no guttural growls. just the soft rustle of clothing and the faint shuffle of feet against pavement. The group watched from the cover of a crumbling garage, frozen in place as the infected passed by. They said it was like watching a parade of ghosts, their heads swiveling in perfect sync, scanning the area as if they were searching for something or someone. I've heard similar stories since then, and the details are disturbingly consistent. These herds don't stumble aimlessly like the infected we've known. They move with purpose, their steps measured, their movements coordinated. One survivor described seeing a silent herd moving through a field at dusk. They weren't clustered together as usual, but spaced out evenly, like a search party. The survivor stayed hidden in a ditch as they passed, holding their breath, terrified that even the sound of exhaling might give them away. The herd didn't stop, didn't deviate, but the survivor said the silence was almost worse than the noise. It felt intentional, deliberate, as if the infected were conserving their energy for something. What's most unsettling is how these silent herds seem to react, or not react. Survivors have reported trying to distract them with noise traps, only to find that they don't respond the way we've come to expect. One group set off a car alarm to lure a herd away from their safe house. Normally, the infected would have swarmed the noise, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. But this time, the herd paused, turned toward the sound, and then continued their march as if it didn't matter. It's as if they've learned to ignore distractions, focusing only on their unknown goal. There's also the way these herds seem to avoid traps. Survivors have described setting up tripwires, pitfalls, and other deterrents, only to watch the infected step around them, as if they knew exactly where they were. One man told me about setting up a barricade of overturned furniture in the hallway of an old hospital. He thought it would slow the infected down if they broke in. But when the herd arrived, they didn't even try to push through. They stopped, tilted their heads as if assessing the situation, and then turned back the way they came. He said the experience was more unnerving than any attack, the sense that they were thinking, strategizing. And then there are the symbols. Survivors have noticed that these herds often pass through or gather near areas marked with strange symbols. The spirals, the overlapping lines, the burned etchings we've talked about before. One woman described seeing a herd standing in a perfect circle around a symbol carved into the asphalt of an empty parking lot. They weren't moving, weren't making a sound, just standing there, motionless, as if waiting for something. She didn't stick around to find out what, and I can't say I blame her. Some survivors have started mapping the movements of these silent herds, and patterns are beginning to emerge. They seem to be drawn to certain landmarks, old factories, abandoned water towers, clusters of glowing residue. But their movements aren't random. They follow paths, often straight lines, as if they're being guided. One man described seeing a herd marching down an empty highway at night, their heads tilted back, their eyes reflecting the faint glow of the stars. They didn't stop, didn't stray from their path, and he said it was like watching a procession heading towards some distant, unknowable destination. What's causing this shift in behavior? Some survivors think the infection is evolving again, that these silent herds are a new stage in its development. Others believe they're being controlled, guided by some unseen force. There's even a theory that the infected are responding to the changes in the environment, the silent zones, the glowing residue, the symbols etched into the earth. Whatever the reason, one thing is clear. These aren't the infected we used to know. They're becoming something else, something far more dangerous. If you see a silent herd, don't engage. Don't try to distract them. Don't try to fight them. And for the love of whatever hope you hold on to, don't try to follow them. They're not just a threat. They're a warning, a sign that the rules we've relied on are breaking down even further. Stay hidden, stay quiet, and stay vigilant. The silence of these herds is more than unsettling. It's a harbinger of something much worse. Survivors, as I speak to you now, the threads of this world feel more tangled than ever. Every anomaly, every chilling report, every unsettling discovery. It's all part of a greater tapestry. The infected aren't just shambling nightmares anymore. They're evolving into something deliberate. The land isn't merely reclaiming itself. It's reshaping under rules we don't understand. And the air itself, once invisible and passive, now feels alive, charged, and aware. These aren't random changes. They're threads in a larger pattern, and if we don't start piecing them together, we may never make sense of what's coming. Let's pull on those threads, survivors. The infected, for one, are no longer the mindless predators we once knew. They're adapting, moving with purpose, forming herds, and mimicking our behaviors. They're gathering in places marked by symbols, by spirals and etchings that seem to hum with meaning. It's as if they're drawn to these markings, connected to them in ways we can't see. The question isn't just what they're doing, it's why. Why are they clustering in these places? Why are they standing still, silent, as if waiting for something? And perhaps most importantly, what are they waiting for? The land, too, is shifting in ways that defy logic. Roads end abruptly, landmarks disappear, entire stretches of forest or fields transform overnight. And yet, these changes aren't random. Survivors have noticed patterns, connections. The places where these changes occur often overlap with the silent zones, with the glowing residue, and with the paths of the infected herds. It's as if the world is responding to whatever is reshaping it, adapting just as much as the infected, or perhaps being reshaped alongside them. Whatever force is at work here, it's not acting in isolation. It's connected, tied to the same threads that bind everything else. The air is another piece of this puzzle, one that feels more vital with every report I receive. Survivors have described it as heavy, charged, alive. It hums, it crackles, it distorts reality. The whispers carried on the wind, the shimmering distortions that disorient and confuse, the oppressive silence that seems to watch. These are all signs of something more. The air isn't just a medium anymore. It's a force, an active participant in whatever transformation is underway. Survivors who've encountered these phenomena often describe feeling as if they've stepped into another world, one where the rules of nature no longer apply. And then there are the symbols. These markings are everywhere now, burned into the ground, etched into walls, carved into trees. They're not random graffiti or the mindless scrawlings of the infected. They're deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. Survivors have described seeing them glow faintly at night, pulsing with an energy that feels alive. Some have even claimed to hear whispers emanating from the symbols, voices speaking in languages they can't understand. These symbols are more than just markers. They're a language, a message, though whether it's meant for us or for something else remains unclear. The connections between these threads are undeniable. The infected are drawn to the symbols. The land shifts and reshapes itself near these markings. The air grows heavier, charged with energy, in places where the symbols appear. It's all connected, survivors, and that connection points to a larger force at work. Something is reshaping this world, and it's not just the infection. Something deeper, older, more deliberate. What does it all mean? I wish I could tell you. I wish I had answers. But all I have are the same questions you're asking, the same fears and uncertainties. Is this some new phase of the infection, spreading beyond the living to reshape the land itself? Is it the earth reacting to the chaos we've unleashed, adapting to a new equilibrium? Or is it something entirely different, something we haven't even begun to comprehend? What I do know is this: we can't afford to ignore these changes. Every anomaly, every whisper, every symbol is a piece of the puzzle. They're clues, signs of what's coming. And while we may not understand them yet, we can't stop looking, can't stop questioning. Our survival depends on it. Survivors, as you navigate this fractured world, remember that you're not alone. Every one of you is a thread in this tapestry, a piece of the story that's still being written. Your observations, your experiences, your warnings, they matter. They're how we make sense of the chaos, how we find patterns in the madness. So keep sharing, keep watching, keep moving. Together, we're stronger than the forces that would see us broken. And above all, hold on to hope. The world may be changing in ways we can't predict, but as long as we're here, as long as we're still breathing, still fighting, we have a chance to understand, to adapt, to endure. The threads may be tangled, but they haven't unraveled yet. We're still here, survivors, and that means the story isn't over. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and remember, The only way to move forward is to keep pulling at the threads. Whatever's at the center of this web, we'll face it together.